Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, a circle cutting jig for your bandsaw. Well, before we can do much of anything with this jig, we need to take some measurements on the bandsaw. This jig is specific to your bandsaw. I will be doing it for the Rikon model 10-326. If you have that model, you're in luck because this table and the measurements I give you are for you. For other guys though, you're going to have to take some measurements. So let's head over there and I'll show you what measurements you need. Well, the main part of the jig consists of two sides of a split table that goes on the top of your bandsaw table. You'll have the front leg of it, and then you'll have the rear leg that runs over on this side. Now, you need to get the width of these boards, and in order to get the width of the board, for most saws, you will just measure from the front edge of your blade to the very edge of your table here. In this case, I have a 1/4 inch blade installed in the saw. For the Rikon, we have this rail that our fence assembly rides on, so we're going to have to measure to the outside of that rail. So for that, we're just going to get a square so we know we have an accurate measurement. We're going to line it up and measure just from the teeth of the blade to the edge or outer edge of that rail. And we're looking at 10 1/8. Then you want to add another 1/2 inch. So for the Rikon, it's 10 5/8 wide will be your boards. In order to get the length of the boards, you're going to want to measure from the throat side of your table edge to your blade. And once you get that measurement, add 14 inches to carry on beyond the table. Now for the Rikon, again, we have this rail here, which extends actually beyond that. Because if you have a fence, you're going to want to measure from the edge of your fence to the blade and add another 14 inches after that. The Rikon, however, because of this rail, it actually won't fit inside. So for this, I can give you the measurement of the length of the pieces, and in our case, for the Rikon, to give you a little bit of space between the fence and your jig, we're gonna make the flat pieces for our auxiliary table 26 inches long. We have our length and our width established of our two pieces for the auxiliary table, and now it's a matter of choosing your material. And in my case, it's going to be 3/4 inch thick plywood. This is a higher quality plywood with 13 plies, whereas your construction grade, you'll probably get around 5 plies. It's up to you what you want to use. I just prefer to use this. So now what I need to do is cut two pieces at 10 5/8 wide by 26 inches long. So with the two pieces of ply cut for the front and the rear of the auxiliary table, we now need to get a tongue cut along each edge here of our plywood. So it'll be along this edge of this back piece and along this edge of our front piece of the table. And that tongue is going to be a 1/2 inch wide, but it is going to be 7/16 of an inch thick, centered on our 3/4 inch ply. And now that you have those tongues cut in your front and your back panels of your auxiliary fence, there's one more thing that we need to do before we can put these things together. And what it'll be is we really need to put the front cleat on it, and there will be a keeper there as well. What that does is it acts as a stop so that when you're sliding the jig into place, it makes it so that your pivoting pin will be in the proper alignment for the blade. So for that, we're going to need some 3/4 inch stock. And I think I'm going to check up on the rack and see if I can't use up some old maple. Now, in order to install the rail and the keeper at the front of our auxiliary table, the keeper is easy. That's the piece that goes underneath here, and this is our rail for our fence. The keeper will go under here, and it's the same length as our sub table or our auxiliary table, which is 26 inches, and it's going to be 1.5 inches wide. That's not rocket science. What we need is the measurement from our tabletop down to just below our rail, or if you're without a rail, to the bottom of your fence. Well, it's a little awkward to measure this here to the bottom of the rail, so I have a piece of stock that's clamped to the table. I have a square that's clamped here to give me a reference point, and I have another square here that I can just butt up to the bottom of our rail and take a measurement. And that measurement looks to be 1 3/8. Now we're going to add a 1/16 for clearance, and that will put us at 1 7/16. So a piece at 1.5 for the keeper by 26 by 3/4. I'm using maple, and we'll get another piece here of 1 7/16 by 26 by 3/4 maple. Well, it's now time to mount that cleat that we have made here out of these pieces of maple. And this will be the front panel, and this is the underside of the front panel. So we're just going to line up the one piece that we measured that will clear our table at the front, or our rail. We're just going to line it up, make it perfectly lined up all the way along the edge here, and on both sides. We're going to glue and screw this together, and then our keeper that we cut out of 1.5 inches wide by our 3/4, that will get mounted. Same method, glued and screwed just like that on top, so that you've got that grabbing action, so that the actual sub table won't lift off of your bandsaw table. So test this before you screw it together, obviously, to make sure that you have the right clearance, and if you do, glue and screw it together. We're just going to let that set up for a bit. That way we're not trying to contend with wet glue sliding things all over the place. Once this is dry, or at least partially set up, then we can get in here, drill our pilot holes for our screws. We're going to be using some number 10 by 1.5 inches to secure this rail to our front slab of our auxiliary table. While we're waiting for that to set up, we can mark out and drill all of our countersinks and pilot holes for the screws that will hold our keeper onto the rail. Now before it has a chance to fully set up, we're going to take the squeeze out off of the back of our rail here. And once we get that done, we're going to be using the same method to attach our keeper to our jig assembly. Just one quick note on aligning your screw holes. Because we're using 1.5" fasteners, don't line them up perfectly in line with the ones on this side, because you will end up hitting them. I tried to offset them all, and one I mismeasured. So on the second one right here, I actually had to reduce the size of my screw holding on our keeper because they ended up hitting each other. But all the rest were offset properly, so I'm good to go. Just something to keep in mind: offset your screws if your measurements are the same as mine, because you'll need the clearance for the actual point of the screw. Now before we go too much further, we just want to make sure that everything is looking right, and we can see here that our keeper does in fact hug tight to our rail. We have that 1/16 of play, but we measured for that, and everything here is lined up very nicely, and we can move on to our next step now. So now that we have our cleat on here and we're happy with the way it fits, we can move on to putting on the side rail, which will hold together our split table for our jig. And what I've got is a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch spacer, and that will fit in between our two panels with our tongues facing each other. I'm just going to use some bar clamps. We're going to line up this outer edge to make sure that it is in line, and it's good. And we're going to give just a light pressure with the bar clamps, just enough to hold it together. You don't want to go crazy on it, just a little bit of pressure in there. Now that you have that done, you can take the measurement, and the measurement will be from the inside edge in here by your rail to the outside of this back table. And that in this particular case is going to be 21 1/32 of an inch. So I will cut a piece. It will be the same width as our rail, which was 1 7/16. So let's get that piece of hardwood on, and then we can glue and screw that together. You want to keep in mind that it goes on the outside of the rail. Now once you're happy with your dry fit, you can glue and screw this together. Now make sure that you don't glue that spacer in. That's got to come out in a bit. But for now, glue and screw this together, and when you're done, don't throw out your spacer. We're going to need that later. Well, now that we have this side rail installed, this side of the jig is quite stable. This side, however, is still quite floppy because there's nothing holding it. We now need to install a runner, and the runner is going to do exactly that. It's going to glide along in the miter slot of the bandsaw to help align the jig and to keep it stable, as well as to keep our split table a little more stable. So what you need to do is you need to measure from the exact same place that you did when you got the length of these, but this time you just measure to the miter slot and transfer the measurement. Now for the Rikon, it is from this bar here, it's 7 5/8 from that bar will be your miter slot. So I'm going to line up this piece of UHMW plastic. I've cut it to fit my miter slot. I'm going to screw it in place all the way along to line up with my miter slot of my bandsaw. Well, I've double and triple checked my measurements, and it's 7 5/8, like I said, from the edge of this rail to our runner for our miter slot. So I've cut a board, a scrap piece, just to help me keep it aligned. I've double checked it against the keeper here to make sure that we're square. And now that I'm happy with everything, I'm going to hold it in place. I have the holes pre-drilled with countersinks, and I'm just going to mount this with some number 6 3/4 screws. Now once you get that done, I would take it over to the bandsaw and just test it to make sure that it slides in. Unless you remove the blade, you're not going to get the opportunity to slide it in very far because the blade's going to hit this table, but at least you'll be able to get an idea of whether or not it lines up. The Rikon has a second miter slot, and for my liking, I think I would like to add a second piece of the UHMW plastics to also run into that miter slot to give it more stability. If yours has that and you're going to do that, do not put it on this section here, your front or your leading table at the back. You'll understand more, but it'll only go on the piece that has this keeper on it. Now, if you have the Rikon and you're interested in adding the second UHMW strip for the second miter slot, the distance between the two is 12 5/8 of an inch. And just like I did with the first one, I've cut a piece of scrap ply here to help me get it aligned up and have it perfectly parallel to the first one. And other than trimming off your back waist piece, which we're going to do next, your base at this point is completed. I think for my liking, what I would like to do before getting into trying to trim the base is I would like to put my jig onto the bandsaw and try it in the miter slots, only because of that double miter slot. I just want to make sure everything lines up before I go running it through and cutting it. So I'm going to test that. You don't need a video of that. But then I'm going to show you how to trim it so that the base is completely done. Well, regardless of how much careful measuring I did when I ran it with no blade in the saw to test the fit, true enough, this second miter bar that I put in out of the UHMW plastic didn't quite line up, and it stopped the jig from working. So it's a good thing I checked it. You may want to do the same with yours. So now it's time to run this through the saw to get rid of our waste area, and that would be this area right here. So all we're going to do is we're going to get our miter slot lined up here, push our jig in as far as we can, start the saw, and finish it through all the way on the cut until our keeper touches against, depending on your saw, either the table or your front rail. Well guys, unfortunately that's all the time we have for this week. We've made some great progress on the jig, and there's still plenty more to do, and I hope you're going to join me for that next week when I bring you yet another woodworking video.